The smell hit me before anything else. Not blood. Not death. Something older than that. Something wet and metal and sweet. Like a penny that had been sitting in milk for 100 years. I have spent 60 years trying to forget that smell. And I am telling you now, sitting here in my kitchen at 1 in the morning, that I can still taste it on the back of my tongue. That smell was the first thing wrong with the place. It would not be the last. I want to tell you about the winter of 1926. I want to tell you about a stone building on a hill in western Massachusetts that the state called a hospital, but everyone in the town below called the bad house. I want to tell you about a man in room 4. And I want to tell you what happened to him, and to us, between the 2nd of January and the night of the 21st, when the snow finally stopped falling and the doors of that place were nailed shut from the outside for the first and last time. I was 19 years old. I had taken the job because my mother was sick and my father had been gone for 3 years, and there was no other work that paid in cash on Fridays. The man at the front desk did not ask me about school. He did not ask me about my family. He looked at my hands, which were big for a girl my age, and he asked me if I could lift a grown person. I said yes. He said good. He said I started Monday. That was the whole interview. The building sat at the top of a long road that the town did not plow. You had to walk the last half-mile in the snow, and on the days when the wind came down off the hill it felt like walking into something that did not want you there. The stone was gray and the windows were small, and there were bars on every one of them. Even the ones on the top floor, where no patient could ever reach. I asked another nurse about that once, about the bars on the high windows, and she looked at me for a long time, and then she said, "You will understand in a month." She was right. I did. The people who worked there were not bad people. I want you to know that. The doctor was a tired old man who had lost 2 sons in the war, and he treated the patients like they were his own children, gentle and slow and patient. The head nurse was a heavy woman with a soft voice who hummed hymns under her breath when she changed the sheets. The other girls who worked the floors were like me, poor and young and grateful for the pay. We were not cruel. We were not careless. We loved those patients in the small way that tired people can love strangers. That is what makes the rest of this story hard to tell. There were 38 patients in the building when I started. Most of them were quiet. Most of them had been there for years. There was an old woman in room 12 who thought it was always 1889 and who asked me every morning if her husband had written. I always said yes. I told you we were not cruel. There was a young man in room 20 who could not speak, but who drew the same picture every day, with a piece of charcoal. The same house with the same window, with the same small face inside. And he would smile at me when I brought his lunch, and the smile was the smile of a child. There was a woman in room 7 who sang in a language none of us knew, all night, every night, soft and tuneful and far away. We got used to her singing. We slept to it. We thought of it as the sound of the house. The man in room 4 came in on the 2nd of January. I remember the date, because it was my first day, back after the New Year, and the snow had piled up so high against the side door that we had to dig it out before we could open it. He arrived in a black car that I had never seen before. 2 men I had never seen before brought him in. They did not speak to the doctor. They did not sign the book at the desk. They walked him down the hall, one on each side, and they put him in room 4, and they shut the door, and they left. The whole thing took maybe 4 minutes. The head nurse watched him go, and then she made the sign of the cross, and she did not look at me for the rest of the morning. I want to tell you what he looked like that first day, because everything that came after starts with that face. He was a thin man, maybe 40, maybe older. It was hard to tell. His hair was gray at the sides and dark on top, and it had been cut recently, badly. In the way you cut a person's hair when you do not care if they like it. His skin was the color of old paper. His eyes were brown and ordinary. And that is the part I keep coming back to, because his eyes were the most ordinary thing I have ever seen in my life. There was nothing wrong with them. There was nothing in them at all. He sat on the edge of the bed with his hands folded in his lap, and he did not move, and he did not blink, and he did not speak. He just sat. For 3 days he just sat. On the 4th day he asked me for water. His voice was soft and polite, and he said please, and he said thank you, and I remember thinking, this man is not sick. This man does not belong here. Somebody has made a mistake. I told the head nurse what I thought. She listened to me with her hands clasped together at her waist, and when I was done she said, "Child, you do not know what he is here for, and I am not going to tell you, and I am asking you please, do not go in that room alone after sundown." I asked her why. She said, "Because the night nurses have been asking the same thing about him that you just asked me, and the answer is not a good one." That was the first wrong thing. Not him. Her. The way she said it. The way her hands were shaking when she said it. Just a little, just enough. The smell started in the 2nd week. I told you about the smell already. The penny and milk smell. But I did not tell you that it came from his room. It seeped under the door. It got into the hallway. By the 3rd day of it, the girls were holding cloths over their faces when they walked past room 4. And by the 5th day the doctor came down, himself with a bottle of something sharp and chemical. And he poured it along the bottom of the door. And it did nothing. The smell stayed. It got stronger. We opened the window in his room, even though it was 20 degrees outside, even though the snow blew in and gathered on his floor in a little white drift. The smell stayed. We washed him. We changed his sheets twice a day. We scrubbed the walls. The smell stayed. And the man in room 4 sat on the edge of his bed and folded his hands and watched us work. And he said please. And he said thank you. And his eyes did not change. I want to stop here and tell you something honest. I have told this story to maybe 4 people in my life. My husband, before he passed. A priest, once, in a town I was driving through, who listened to the whole thing, and then put his hand on the back of mine and said, "I believe you, and I have never been more grateful to a stranger." My daughter last year, because I am old now, and I did not want to die with it inside me, and one other person, who I will tell you about at the end. 4 people in 60 years. And every time I tell it, I think, maybe this time it will sound like a story. Maybe this time it will not feel real. But it always does. It always does. The 3rd week is when the patient started to change. The old woman in room 12 stopped asking about her husband. She would sit at her window, and she would look down the hall toward room 4, and she would not eat. The young man in room 20 stopped drawing the house. He drew instead, a long thin shape with no face, over and over, filling page after page, pressing the charcoal so hard it broke in his fingers. The woman in room 7 stopped singing. That was the one that scared me most, because I had not realized until she stopped how much that singing had been holding the building together. The silence she left behind was the loudest silence I have ever heard in my life. I asked the head nurse what was happening. She said, "They can feel him." I said, "Feel what?" She said, "I do not know, child, and I do not want to know. And if you have any sense at all, you will keep your head down, and your eyes on your work, and you will not, under any circumstance, look him in the face." But I did. Of course I did. I was 19. It was a Tuesday late, around 9 in the evening, and I was making the last round of the hall before the night shift took over. I had brought him his supper hours before, and he had not touched it. I went in to take the tray away. He was sitting on the bed, the way he always was, hands folded, back straight. I bent down to pick up the tray, and he said my name. He had never been told my name. I froze with the tray in my hands, and I looked up at him, and I looked at his face, and I made the mistake the head nurse had warned me about. I looked him in the eyes, and his eyes were not ordinary anymore. I do not know how to describe what I saw. I have tried for 60 years, and the closest I can come is this. Have you ever looked into a well, a deep one, and seen that the water at the bottom is moving even though there is no wind? Have you ever stood at the edge of a dark room and known, somehow, with absolute certainty, that something inside it was looking back at you? That is what his eyes were. They were a room, and the room was full. I dropped the tray. I do not remember leaving the room. I remember being in the hallway with my back against the wall, and the head nurse holding me by the shoulders and saying, "What did he do? What did he do? What did he say?" And all I could say was, "He knows my name. He knows my name. He knows my name." That night, the singing came back. But it was not the woman in room 7. The woman in room 7 was sitting in her bed with her hands over her ears, and tears running down her face. The singing was coming from room 4, and it was in her voice. Exactly her voice. Every note, every word in that language none of us knew. Coming from a man who had not, until that night, sung a single note in his life. I should have left then. Every part of me knew it. But I stayed. I stayed because of the old woman in room 12. I stayed because of the boy in room 20. I stayed because the head nurse, who had been at the bad house for 22 years, was sitting in the staff room with her hands shaking around a cup of coffee, and she said to me, "I think we are going to lose them all, and I cannot do this alone, and I am asking you, please, stay until we figure out what to do." I was 19 years old. A woman I respected asked me for help. I said yes. I want you to understand that. I want you to understand that staying was not bravery. It was not curiosity. It was a yes I gave to a tired woman in a kitchen at the end of a long hall, and I have lived with that yes for 60 years. The doctor tried to get someone to come. He sent letters. He sent telegrams. He called the number he had been given for the men in the black car, and the number did not work anymore. He called the state. The state said the man in room 4 was not on any list they had. The state said there was no record of any patient being sent to us on the 2nd of January. The state said, and I will never forget this, the state said, "We do not know what you are talking about." And then they hung up. By the 4th week the smell had spread to the whole first floor. By the 4th week 3 of the patients had stopped eating completely, and we were feeding them through tubes. By the 4th week the boy in room 20 had drawn the long thin shape, with no face on every inch of his walls, floor to ceiling, in charcoal so thick it looked like soot, and when I went in to clean it he grabbed my wrist, and he looked at me with eyes that were finally terribly clear. And he said the first word I had ever heard him speak. He said, "Run." I want to pause here, because I know some of you are listening to this late at night. And I know you are the kind of person who finds stories like this and stays with them. And I want to say something to you, just for a minute, before I tell you the rest. If you are still here, if you are still with me, stay close. There are not many of us left who remember what happened in that building, and I would rather not be the only one carrying it. If this story is reaching you the way I think it is, take a second, somewhere in the next minute or two, and follow along. And leave a word below about what you think he was, because I have my own answer, and I have carried it for 60 years, and I would like, for once, to hear what someone else thinks. And then come back. Because the worst of it is still ahead, and I need you here for it. The night the doctor went into room 4 was the 18th of January. There was a storm coming down off the hill. The wind was screaming against the windows. The lights had been flickering since supper. He told us, the head nurse and me, and the 2 night girls, that he was going to talk to the man, that he was going to ask him, plainly, who he was, and what he wanted, and why he had been brought to us. He said it the way a man says things when he has run out of other ideas. The head nurse begged him not to go. He went anyway. He took a chair from the staff room, and he carried it down the hall, and he opened the door of room 4. And he sat down in front of the man on the bed, and he closed the door behind him. We listened from the hall. We heard the doctor's voice, low and gentle, asking his questions. We heard a long silence. We heard the doctor's voice again, sharper this time. We heard another silence, and then we heard the doctor begin to cry. I have never in my whole life heard a grown man cry the way the doctor cried in that room. It was not sadness. It was not pain. It was the sound a person makes when something they believed in their whole life is taken away from them in a single moment. The head nurse was on her knees in the hallway with her rosary in her hands. The night girls were holding each other. I was standing at the door, and I had my hand on the handle, and I was going to open it, and then I heard the man in room 4 speak. He spoke for a long time. He spoke softly. I could not make out the words. I do not know what language it was. I am not even sure it was a language. But the doctor stopped crying. And then the doctor began to laugh. And the laugh was not the doctor's laugh. The laugh was the laugh of a man who had heard the funniest joke of his life. And the joke was him. And he understood it now. And there was nothing left of him but the understanding. The doctor came out of the room 20 minutes later. He was smiling. His eyes were wet. He walked past us without looking at us. He walked down the hall and out the front door and into the storm in his shirt sleeves, with no coat, and he did not come back. They found him 3 days later, 8 miles down the road, sitting up against a fence post, frozen solid, still smiling. That was the moment I understood what we were actually dealing with. The head nurse called the police that night. The police could not come because of the storm. The head nurse called the church. The priest could not come because of the storm. The head nurse sat in the staff room with her rosary in her lap. And she looked at me, and she said, "Child, in the morning, when the sun comes up, you are going to walk down the hill. And you are going to keep walking until you reach the town. And you are not going to look back, and you are not going to come back. Do you understand me?" I said yes. She said good. She said, "I am sorry I asked you to stay." She said it like she meant it. She said it like she was already saying goodbye. That was the 18th of January. The snow did not stop until the 21st. I did not leave in the morning. I want to tell you I did. I want to tell you I was smart, that I was 19 and scared and I ran. But the truth is I could not leave the head nurse alone in that building with him. And I could not leave the old woman in room 12. And I could not leave the boy in room 20. And I could not leave the woman in room 7 who had stopped singing. So I stayed. For 3 more days, I stayed. The patients began to die on the 19th. Not from anything. The old woman in room 12 was found in her bed in the morning, her eyes open, her hands folded in her lap the same way the man in room 4 folded his. The boy in room 20 was next, that afternoon, the same way, hands folded, eyes open. By the night of the 20th, 11 of the 38 were gone. None of them had been sick. None of them had been hurt. They had simply stopped. As if someone had reached inside them and turned a small thing off, the way you turn off a lamp. And the smell from room 4 was gone. That is the part I want you to understand. The smell, that terrible penny and milk smell, that had filled the building for almost 3 weeks, was completely gone by the morning of the 20th. The hallway smelled like nothing. The air was clean. And I knew, the way you know things in dreams, that the smell had not gone away. It had gone into them. Into the patients. Into the ones who had stopped. The smell had moved. The night of the 21st, the head nurse and I were the only 2 staff left in the building. The night girls had run. I do not blame them. I would have run too, if I had any sense. There were 27 patients left alive, most of them sleeping, most of them not eating, all of them quiet. There was the man in room 4, and there were the 2 of us. The head nurse came to me at midnight. She had a key in her hand. It was the key to room 4. She said, "I am going to lock his door from the outside. And I am going to lock every other door in the hallway. And then I am going to walk out of this building with you. And I am going to nail the doors shut behind us. And I am going to call every person I know in the morning until somebody comes up that hill with fire. She said it calm. She said it like she had already decided. She said, "Are you with me?" I said yes. We started at the far end of the hall. We locked every door. We told every patient who was awake that we were sorry, that someone would come for them in the morning, that we loved them. The woman in room 7 looked at me when I locked her door. She had not looked at anyone in 2 weeks. She opened her mouth and she said, in perfect English, in a voice I had never heard her use, she said, "He is not in that room anymore." And then she lay down, and she folded her hands, and she closed her eyes. The head nurse and I ran. We did not lock his door. We did not have to. We knew, both of us, in the same instant, what the woman in room 7 had told us. We ran down the hallway, and we ran down the stairs, and we ran through the front door, and we did not stop running until we were at the bottom of the hill, and even then we only stopped because the head nurse fell to her knees in the snow and could not get up. I picked her up. I carried her. She was a heavy woman, and I was 19 years old. And I do not know where the strength came from, but I carried her into the town, and I banged on the first door I saw, and a man I had never met opened it, and I said, "Please, please, help us," and he did. He let us in. He gave us water. He wrapped us in blankets. He listened to the head nurse, who could barely speak, and then he went and got 4 other men, and they went up the hill in the morning with axes and lamps and rifles. They came back at noon. They would not tell us what they had found. They went into a room together, and they shut the door, and they talked for 2 hours, and when they came out, the man, whose house we were in, said to me, "You are going to go home to your mother now, and you are not going to speak about this to anyone, and you are not going to come back to this town, and I am going to give you money for the train." I said, "What about the patients?" He looked at me. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, "Child, there are no patients. There is no one in that building. There never was." I went home. The head nurse went somewhere else. I do not know where. I never saw her again. I tried to write her, a year later, at the address I had for her, and the letter came back. I tried to find the building, 10 years later, when I was older and braver, and the road up the hill was gone. There was a forest where the road had been. There was no building at the top. There was no foundation. There was no sign that anything had ever stood there. I asked in the town. The people who were old enough to remember would not look at me. The people who were young enough not to remember laughed and said I had the wrong town. I have thought about him every day for 60 years. I have thought about his ordinary brown eyes and the room behind them. I have thought about the smell, the penny and milk smell, and where it went. I have thought about the doctor laughing in the storm with no coat on, and the old woman in room 12 with her hands folded, and the boy in room 20 saying run, and the woman in room 7 saying he is not in that room anymore. I have thought about what she meant. I have a guess. I do not like my guess. I have never said it out loud, and I am not going to say it now. But I will tell you the last thing. The 4th person I told this story to, after my husband and the priest and my daughter, was a man who came to my door 6 years ago. He was old, older than me, and he was thin and tired, and he had ordinary brown eyes. He said he had been looking for me for a long time. He said he had been one of the men in the black car, the one who brought the man in room 4 to us, on the 2nd of January, 1926. He said he had been 19 years old then, the same age as me. He said he had not known what he was bringing. He said no one had told him. He said he had spent his whole life trying to find out, and he had found out enough, and he had come to tell me one thing before he died. He said the smell never goes away. It just moves. And then he left. I have lived a long life. I have been loved, and I have loved back, and I have raised a child, and I have buried a husband, and I have done the small good work that a person can do in a life. I am not afraid of dying. I am 80 years old and my body is tired, and I am ready when it is time. But I will tell you what I am afraid of. I am afraid that when I close my eyes for the last time, and the room around me goes dark, and the small thing inside me turns off the way it turned off in the old woman in room 12, I am afraid that the last thing I will smell, in the dark, is a penny that has been sitting in milk for 100 years. And I am afraid I will know whose room I am in. Good night.